Hello, I'm Paul Bulpitt, your host, and welcome to the Beautiful Business Podcast, where today I'm joined by Tim Foster MBE. Tim Foster is an Olympic rowing gold medalist and former head coach of the Swiss national rowing team. Tim won a gold medal at the Sydney Olympics in 2000 as part of a men's coxless four with Sir Steve Redgrave, Sir Matthew Pinsent, and James Cracknell. After retiring from the sport, Tim spent many years successfully coaching other rowers. And today, Tim works as a business coach and head of performance for the League Managers Association. Today, we're going to talk with Tim about the high performance environment that enabled him and his crew to win gold at the Sydney Olympics. As a business owner myself, I'm curious to know what Tim sees. I want to know what the difference is between elite sports environment and a high performance business environment. We're going to get into some of the things that make that environment, such as trust, conflict. We're going to look at how people manage pressure in those moments. And also, how do you stay motivated after the highs of winning an Olympic gold medal? Mostly, I'm excited to have a living, breathing, Olympic gold medal winning athlete with us on the podcast today.
Olympic gold medals are lovely in that they give you a dream, they give you a real purpose, they give you a real focus. They also give you a timeline that actually in 4 years' time or 2 years' time, depending on where in the cycle you are, you have to deliver. The challenge is then to put that into normal life, into business, and actually, to me, that's one of the bits about being purpose driven is having this sort of strategy and direction of knowing what you do want to achieve and having that clearly defined.
Welcome to the Beautiful Business Podcast from the Wow Company. If you're searching for the right strategies, tools, and connections to ignite your thinking and elevate your business, then join us for a fortnightly dose of inspiration. Our guests range from industry-leading agencies and cutting-edge tech pioneers to motivational speakers and executives, all offering actionable insights to help you thrive in profit and purpose. So, whether you're a growing consultancy or an agency leader, this podcast is your source of knowledge and encouragement to spark meaningful change in your business and beyond.
Tim, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
So with all of our guests, we start off with one question, which is to tell us something about you that we don't already know or we can't easily find on the internet.
Good question. And actually, probably as I sit here and look behind the screen, there's a guitar that I've been learning to play for 30 years. I grew up wanting to be a rock guitarist, never was, and still 30 years later, don't necessarily have the confidence to play in public.
Okay, but you're taking lessons and learning?
Yeah, well, I'd definitely say I'm improving, albeit from a pretty low base. But no, I love playing. I really enjoy music. But there's something in me, and kind of if there's any kind of psychotherapists listening, they might sort of delve into this as to why I don't feel I can then play for anyone outside my immediate family.
So who would be your musical inspirations?
Oh, actually, as I turned the volume up on this webcam, it told me that Cat Stevens was the last thing that was playing. So,
Lovely. Me too, by the way. So, thinking about your rowing career, when did you first know that you wanted to be a professional athlete? When did that dream start?
I never knew anything about rowing really before I started. I grew up in Bedford, and at about the age of 14, I'd tried the football, the cricket, the rugby, the more traditional sports. Was okay at them. Was a good team player, but then I found rowing a little bit by accident. Went and had a go. Really wasn't very good at it, which kind of frustrated me enough to want to come back and get better. And then I guess that perpetuated. And by the time I was about 17, I guess moving on to 18, I realized I was quite good at this, and this is something I wanted to do. When I first started, I did it because I enjoyed it. And actually, I'd still say that was probably my greatest talent, was the fact that I still enjoyed it 15 years later. And it was my job by that point. And that drive and desire and passion, I think, is what got me through. If you told the 17, 18-year-old me what was going to be necessary to get to where you wanted to go, I don't know if that would have given me purpose or whether it would have put me off. I don't know. I mean, but in the end, actually, I was somebody that, I had that dream put the dream into action, and look back now without any regrets.
Yeah, indeed. And for anyone watching or listening, there's this fantastic documentary that is still available on YouTube called Gold Fever that shows what is it, the 2.5 years leading up to the Sydney Olympics.
It is. I mean, the BBC approached us, and actually, this was at a day when I don't think there had been any sports documentaries of a similar ilk. And actually, they asked, could they give us video cameras? And we basically videoed 3 years of our lives. Just like, for example, if we were here and talking, there'd be another camera pointing at us, and they'd have that. And we grew to kind of ignore it in a way. It was a little bit like a sort of silent friend, I suppose, in a way. You became so used to it being there that actually it didn't interfere. And they captured what became a 4 episodes documentary series that actually is a really good sort of representation of what it was like to be an Olympic athlete, to be sort of aiming for the Olympics. It is good. It's gritty. There's bits in there that I sort of blush at. My 14-year-old daughter, because she started to row, she was encouraged to watch it by her coach. She watched about 2 minutes, at which point you see me naked, which is not what you want to see your dad. So actually, there's bits in there that are kind of really revealing in more than one sense of the word, but also actually it shows what goes into it. And I was lucky enough to row with Steve Redgrave. And I think before the documentary, there were probably people who'd accused Steve of being lucky because he always wins. And when they watched the documentary, they realized, that's not necessarily what's the driving factor.
Yeah, and each of you have your own journey, and I guess it's easy to watch that documentary now with the benefit of hindsight because we know what happens at the end. But I think the final episode of the documentary is it like finishes before, sort of like 2 months out from Sydney, and at that point you wouldn't have known.
We suffer a really bad defeat 6 weeks before the Olympics, which is when the documentary finishes. Got to the last and final race before the Olympics and got absolutely thrashed. And in a funny way, it was probably the best thing that could have happened to us, because the way we reacted to it, I think, was really positive. And it probably, in a real simple way, showed us that the medal wasn't just ours in waiting; it was for us to earn. And when it came to the Olympics, we're all going to start level, and it was going to be who went the fastest over the kind of preceding 6 minutes.
So by the time you get to Sydney, you get to the final, you're sat on the start line. There's 35,000 people in the stadium, quite literally millions of people watching rowing, who, I don't know, like rowing just wasn't that big a sport at the time, but all of a sudden you've got 10 million people watching on TV. You've had 40 odd races together in the build up to this thing, 4 years. Sat on the start line, what's going through your head? What are you telling yourself at that point?
It was a really interesting time. I mean, I mentioned briefly earlier about it being an amateur sport. Rowing was always a small sport. It was something that you did because you had a dream. It wasn't something that ever got a lot of publicity until the Sydney Olympics, that actually Steve Redgrave was aiming for his 5th Olympic gold medal. He'd become Britain's greatest Olympian in Atlanta by winning his 4th. And actually, that was why the BBC were interested in doing a documentary series. That was why people were interested in watching. There are all these sort of slightly odd pressures in that the athletes I'd always looked up to, the track and field athletes at the time that you actually get to meet in the Olympic Village, would come up and, oh, you're the guys that are going to win us the gold medal, are you? And it was like, oh gosh, actually that's another pressure, because to put it into perspective as well, it was an era where Britain was not very successful at sport. We'd only won 1 gold medal in Atlanta, whereas in the last few Olympics, we've been winning 20 odd, which is fantastic. But for us, sitting on the start, there was that pressure. There was pressure of people. The biggest pressure, I'll admit, was the internal one of actually, this is what I've always wanted to do. My history, I guess, rewinding 4 years from that Sydney final was in the Atlanta Olympics, where I'd been in the same event in a very similar position, in a position where I could and maybe should win, but we didn't win. The Australians win, and once they've won the first one, they don't give you a best of 3. That's kind of the way of the world. And actually, I do remember thinking, that actually it was my time, it was my chance. I actually felt very well prepared in a way that I don't mean to sound, I guess, big-headed in any way. I actually believed that if we did what we could do, we'd win. And therefore, the challenge was to do what we needed to do, like a process, sort of the tasks that we'd practiced so many times. It was about putting those into practice, and actually delivering on the day. A lot of Olympic finals, and it's slightly odd in sport. I think people sort of talk about 110% sometimes. But actually, it's very unusual for Olympic finals to be won in world records times. It's slightly skewed by track and field in that they deliberately build a track that's very fast, or conditions that deliberately make it seem like it. Actually, it's about delivering. It's the team that delivers close to 100% that wins, rather than actually underperforming on the day. And maybe, going back to those feelings of sitting on the start, it was right. This is what we need to do. This is what actually we've practiced so many thousand times. Now's the chance to do that. Even now, 25 years later, if you sat behind me, which is the position Steve Redgrave was, and he was the one who gave the calls, if you said legs, I know exactly what I need to do for the next 45 seconds in terms of technique, in terms of movement, in terms of kind of coordination. I might not physically be able to perform it at the same level as I used to be able to, but actually, again, that was one of the reasons we did all the practice and all of the training that we did, so that we could do it and do it under pressure.
One thing that comes out through the documentary is that, so there's four of you in the boat, and you're all very different characters, different backgrounds. What really struck me was the pressure, how you seem to deal with pressure differently. So obviously these things are edited, but every clip of you're smiling.
I'd describe us as, let's say, four very different personalities, four very different backgrounds. We actually finally, the night before the Olympics, actually talked about why we were doing what we were doing. It was odd because we'd always talked about what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. Sort of verbalized this very well about actually understanding the reasons why. And it was odd that we hadn't done this. We've been together for 4 years, basically sort of living out of each other's sort of pockets and sort of going through it all together until we actually talked about why. And Steve, for the first time, talked about winning his 5th Olympic gold medal. It was always something that was out there in the public eye, but it had never been something we'd discussed as a team. He'd talk about winning the races he'd not won yet, and how were we going to do that. But for the first time, he shared with us what it's going to be like to become a 5 times Olympic gold medalist. Matthew talked about not just winning, but becoming a legend. He wanted to be the best of the best and kind of seen as such. For me, I've touched on it earlier, a lot of my motivation was righting the wrong of 4 years before, that actually I'd been in this position of could and should, and now had to get myself into a position of would win. And actually, that was what I talked about. And to be honest, James just burst into tears. He couldn't get a word out. And actually, that was James, and you realised how emotional he was and how invested he was into it. I mean, one of his absolute strengths is his drive, determination, and it was so much that he couldn't even speak, and yet that said enough.
For you, I'm really curious. How do you manage that pressure? What is actually going on inside?
I mean, we did work a lot on the psychology of training and how that built us confidence, and also then how we would deal in terms of producing on race day. And you mentioned the 35,000 people, the millions watching, the pressure of being favourites to win. So we did work a lot on that. I'll admit, and actually, there's a silly story on the morning of the Olympic final. I start going through my calming techniques and I fall asleep about 2 hours before the race. And Matthew gives me an almighty elbow, and sort of like, because basically Matthew's not slept for 48 hours. He hasn't managed to eat anything. And actually, I realised I'd overdone it. I'd worked so hard on these calming strategies that actually, in order to get myself in the right zone, as it were, I started to think about racing, start thinking about winning, start to kind of excite myself to kind of get myself up and awake again. And actually, then redress the balance again. So I'd say it was one of my strengths was my calmness under pressure. I guess I've managed to sort of work out the good strategies for myself.
We talked a bit about certainly in your Coxless fours for Sydney, the makeup of different makeup of each of the guys in the boat there. But from your experience, what do you think are the underlying factors that made that a great team? But we can maybe take on and understand more about building great teams more broadly.
Again, I think it's a really good question because yes, you've got an expertise and you've got the people in there that are fantastic athletes. And then, okay, it is an extreme and an unusual example to be rowers aiming for winning the Olympics. And I appreciate that's not always so relevant for everybody in terms of lung capacity or physical sort of body mass. But I honestly believe one of the reasons we were a good team was the way we worked together. And I think this is the bit that relates to others. And we would talk about, and it was borrowed from a guy called Patrick Lencioni, who has a sort of a model of dysfunctions of a team. And yet we twisted that into the positive and talk about the positive functions of a team, the functions of a high performing team. And they were trust, sort of conflict, stroke competition, commitment, accountability, and then achieving the right results. So the foundation was trust, and actually that came from our relationships with each other. It came from our understanding and the expertise of everybody being able to do their own role, the consistency of that. We talked about having not just competition in the group where we knew we ultimately needed each other, but it didn't stop us being competitive because, yeah, we were competitive animals. And actually it was almost sort of justifying our own positions. And on the back of that, and probably on a similar level, there was conflict. So we weren't scared of having difficult conversations. If it was actually going to make the boat go faster, this was a conversation we'd be willing to have. And that was being self-critical as well as being critical to your peers. There was no real hierarchy in it. We didn't expect the coach or the boss to be the only one that would criticize some of the really powerful moments. And I'll admit that the race where we get beaten just before the Olympics, one of the reasons I think it was good for us, it allowed us to have what was a really difficult conversation that needed to be had. And if we'd won that race, we maybe wouldn't have had the environment that conversation could have happened. I still use occasion, and it's from the documentary where literally I'm about to go in to surgery. I ended up having 2 discs removed from my sort of lumbar spine, which no rower had ever had that issue. And then that operation, they'd never come back to rowing. And yet I'm turning to the camera and saying, when I win that gold medal, I'll know what I've had to go through to do it, and it'll be worthwhile. And perversely, I still believe that. I still kind of, probably the only thing I would change in my whole career would be I would look after myself better when I was younger. And there was a self-belief in how I could perform if I can get myself to be able to sit down or walk or get out of bed. And actually when I could do that, then I could get into a swimming pool. And I guess my mentality was, as long as I knew where I was going and I'm making progress to that goal, that was a good day. I wasn't judging it in that, hang on a minute, my teammates are off winning world championships and I'm walking sort of 20 foot today. I'm actually trying to relate it, but actually I could only walk 10 foot yesterday. So actually today's twice as good as yesterday. And therefore I'm going to get myself back to this goal that I want to achieve.
Would you say generally you take that mentality through your life since Sydney, through the rest of your adult life?
It's a genuine challenge of leaders, for example, to be self-aware and to be self-critical, because none of us are perfect. None of us have got the answer. And if we've got the answer in one situation, it's probably a different answer given other people in other situations. So I do think we could all improve. It was actually, in a funny way, a good reason for me to retire as a rower, in that actually I realized I wasn't going to get any better. And actually that was a good reason to transition into being a coach and moving away with a real defined point, because some people hang on for goals that actually are getting further away than they but they're still chasing, but actually the goalposts moving quicker than they are, and that's difficult to deal with. But in a funny way, because of my injuries, because of I guess this sort of desire for self-improvement, I realised it was time. The challenge then, and I'll admit it's not always as clear. I mean, Olympic gold medals are lovely in that they give you a dream, they give you a real purpose, they give you a real focus. They also give you a timeline that actually in 4 years' time or 2 years' time, depending on where in the cycle you are, you have to deliver. The challenge is then to put that into normal life, into business, and actually, to me, that's one of the bits about being purpose driven is having this sort of strategy and direction of knowing what you do want to achieve and having that clearly defined.
You've talked a bit about your coach Jürgen Gröve. Had this fantastic record of winning from, was it 1972?
Jürgen, I'd challenge many of the sort of watchers and listeners to know who Jürgen is, but I'd probably suggest he was the world's most successful sports coach. I mean, he wins Olympic gold medals every Olympics from 72 to 2016. So for 44 years, being at the top of his game, moving with the times in that times improve in terms of what's needed to win gold medals, training methodologies change, athletes change, generations. He was able to move with that. And to me, that was remarkable. I think the other remarkable thing about him is that he was never a rower himself, but actually he was effectively taught to be a coach and then was assigned to sports rather than it being the former player that transitions into coaching, which effectively I was. And actually Jürgen was having to describe feelings he'd never felt or movements he'd never done. And
so he'd never competed. He'd never competed in a rowing boat.
no, I mean, actually, all it proved was his skill as a coach wasn't dependent on his expertise as a rower, and I'd always thought that was a disadvantage for him because actually, when I moved into coaching, I'd been the expert, I'd been there, done that. I could actually get in and do demonstrations if I needed to, and had a really clear idea of how I would have wanted to have been led or coached. And yet now, 20 odd years later, I can't answer the question as to whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage to having been an expert. That actually, when I transition into a coach, I make the mistake of assuming everybody should be coached in the way that I would have wanted to have been coached or been led in the way I would have wanted to have been led.
Yeah, and there's plenty of examples across sports, aren't there, of the talented player who actually fails to make that transition for various reasons.
Oh, completely. I mean, my transition was slightly blinded, and actually in the first year I get a lot of success. My team wins the world championships that I'm coaching, and at this point I think I'm a really good coach because I'm 1 year in and we're already world champions. And Jürgen, there was a whole group of people came up and congratulated me, and Jürgen comes up and says, "Tim, anybody can do it once." And actually, I hated hearing it, but it was really good advice because I do the same thing the next year and they're fairly successful. I do it the following year and they're not successful. And by this point, I'm blaming them, thinking, why are they not listening or why are they not getting, why don't they get it? And it was actually probably 4 years into my leadership journey, I suppose, that I finally realized, oh, hang on, I'm not in the boat anymore. That actually me jumping back in either physically to do demonstrations or to get it done because it was easy to get it done wasn't helping because all it was doing was making it look easy and belittling possibly the athlete that was trying to do it or struggling to do it. But also mentally realizing that people did have different reasons why, different motivations. That was a really important thing. And you didn't just have to show them the way and them therefore would have the motivation to do it. Some people needed more motivation or more instruction. And understanding that was really important. And I do think a lot of former elite performers struggle with that. I mean, some of the work I do now with the football managers, with the League Managers Association, a lot of them are fantastic former players that have had fantastic careers. They've been thrust into the sort of management role because it's that time in their own sort of journey, but also because it's believed that, because you're an expert, you'll be a great leader. unfortunately, the list in my book of really top performers in sports that have become really top coaches is very small.
So you talked about the alignment, you talked about the culture he created. Definitely that thing of adapting your leadership style to different individuals is a really useful takeaway. What were the ingredients of the culture? How would you describe that culture?
Um, I'd probably go back to the sort of the trust, the competition, commitment, accountability, that sort of element that fundamentally sets what we were doing. In that there was a trust that included confidence, it included the expertise of us all. It was actually what was broken when I put my hand through the window. Probably rather than the physical um, recovery, actually the worst thing that was broken wasn't the window or my hand, it was actually the trust. And actually that was what was really important to get back. I mean, James literally didn't say a single word to me for about 2 months. So it was,
Because he was frustrated that you'd done something that was basically against
yeah,
the
for
good
him,
of
he
the
couldn't
team.
believe that I'd done that. I put myself in that situation. I mean, it was an accident and it happens. And actually, James had been at the party earlier in the evening, but he'd gone home and I hadn't. Um, but yeah, for him, it was a real breaking of trust, and I think it was so fundamental. I think to the way that we worked together, because it then allowed us to have conflict and competition. That yes, we would sort of batter ourselves against each other, sort of metaphorically on the water, kind of desperate to beat you or whoever, but then actually come in and have breakfast and actually know that that's for the good of us all, or the fact that you might have a very different opinion than I have, but actually realizing, yeah, when we leave the room, we've made the decision as to what's actually the way we're going to move forwards. That I think that was something we were really good at in terms um, of of the culture that we had. It wasn't something, and okay, working with businesses. Okay, unfortunately, sometimes you get them all. We're really proud of ourselves. We do a quarterly review. It's like, well, actually, we used to do it twice a day, kind of, and actually in a sort of not always a formal way, but whether that was a conversation or whether that was the way we were able to kind of hold ourselves accountable was by being honest with each other.
Yeah, so that comparison between sort of like the elite sports environment and the high performing business environment is really interesting analogy, because you said that even in your gold medal race at the Olympics, the first thing that your coach says to you is, "You didn't row very well. You could have rowed better." Um, so I guess in a business environment, I guess you tend to less frequently have that gold medal moment. You don't have that date. You knew years in advance that on that day you were going to be racing against these other countries. Hopefully, you don't have that quite so much in business. But that feedback bit is, uh, ki- uh, I don't see many businesses where someone would have any level of success. Someone's just closed a deal and their their manager or colleague says to them, "Well, okay, well done on doing that, but actually you could have got a load more." Or it's saved up for a quarterly or God forbid annual review. So there's definitely that difference in terms of like feedback and the rate at which you get feedback or the amount of feedback. What are the other? So I suppose I've got two questions. One is, have you seen that level of high performing feedback take place in business? And secondly, more broadly, what are the other differences between that elite sports environment and what you found going into business environments?
There's a lot that sport can learn from business and business can learn from sport. I think there's a lot of similarities, albeit the end product might be a bit different. But it is easier in sport. We say when you've got a set target, you've got a goal that's 3.5 years in the future, and you can make an assessment as to what it was like or what's going to be necessary to win. The high performing, sustainably successful teams do have that culture of difficult conversation, of conflict, that what ultimately leads in my mind to accountability is actually I we've collectively worked out what we want to do. We've collectively agreed what and sort of how we're going to do it, and therefore actually I can hold you to account as much as you holding yourself to account, as actually are you then going to deliver it. And I think some of the businesses do get it. I think, to a really good standard. But it's probably the thing I see most when I do work with businesses is that accountability piece of actually, have you created an environment on a day-to-day level that allows you to be honest, and sometimes brutally honest when it's really necessary. I related to the sporting example because, yeah, I mean, when we lose in what was the World Cup final in 2000, 6 weeks before the Olympics, having lost, we had this meeting where everyone tried to individually take responsibility, and that was necessary. Jurgen, as the leader, said it was his fault, which was true, but not the whole truth. I had probably let us down, and that quality hadn't been as good as it should be, and the quality was very much in my remit of. So we'd all tried to take individual responsibility, but then actually the second half of the meeting was actually we had to criticize each other, and I had to tell who at the time were our only reigning Olympic champions that they were being a bit unprofessional, that actually they were overweight, that actually I have no power in the game, like I'm a member of the team, and actually you could probably argue in a lot of people's eyes sort of lesser member of the team, yet actually I'm proposing that there's something that they've just not addressed that they really need to address that will help us win. And what was interesting was, looking at it now, is it could have gone very wrong, but I didn't consider that at the time, because actually to me the environment's there that I can say this, that actually I can accuse them of being overweight and therefore we need to lose weight. And actually for them it was something that they genuinely hadn't thought of, because bigger is better. In other things being equal, the bigger and stronger you are, the faster you'll go. But what I was introducing was the concept of, well, actually the boat sits a bit deeper in the water too. So if we can be as powerful and be lighter, then we'll go faster. So actually it wasn't a conversation they wanted to have, but we were able to have it. And by the time we left the room, the agreement was that they would lose weight, and they do. Actually, they lose quite a bit of weight, as it turns out. And actually, taking it back into that sort of business context, there's no way we could have had that conversation if it was up here as a really high level of conflict. If we'd never had conflict before, it was probably the highest example that I could think of in our journey, but it was just a small step and a necessary step compared to what we were actually doing in terms of our environment and our culture during sort of every other day.
Yeah, and I guess if you look at a winning margin of 0.4 of a fraction of a second winning margin, that possibly could have made it. But there must have been a high level of trust for you to be able to sit there and tell, just to put this into context, tell Britain's greatest ever Olympian that he was possibly overweight. Yeah,
I'm sure I would have given it a second thought, but no more than a second thought, because our accountability was, well, will it make the boat go faster? And I genuinely believed it would make the boat go faster, that actually if Steve and Matthew lost weight, we would go faster as a team. Are you able to have that conversation when it's really necessary, of that will it make the boat go faster conversation?
So before you said about the 5 functions of it, or how you've modeled, taken a positive spin, I guess, on the 5 dysfunctions, but look at the 5 functions of a team. When you go into businesses now, do you take that model? Is that a model that you take with you?
It is. I mean, a lot of what I do now is trying to take, I guess, my learnings from sport, whether it's my own athlete coaching or even the working with the football managers experience. I guess I've been lucky enough to see some really good leaders of experience, some, whether it be Jurgen or some of the other coaches. There are some of the mistakes I made as an athlete, as a coach, and then as a coach of coaches, even, that actually, for example, in football, they push back, and I'll come in and talk about trust, and they say, well, actually, we've got 60 days. Like, how do I fast forward trust? Because, yeah, in rowing, you might have 3 years and you can build it, but in football, yeah, the reality is it's a short-term cycle that they're working in. So I do. I'll take that model in, and just to give a lens or a framework, I'm personally not sort of wedded to any one particular model. I think ultimately it's about you understanding the concept, and there might be a particular theory that really resonates with you. But for me, that positively flipped Lencioni model gives a really good way of delving into whether it be culture or team dynamics. that actually I think can help businesses, because some of the stuff we do is get them to actually analyze where they are. And actually they do have, to be honest, I did have one business I worked with where they worked really nicely for an afternoon. Then after the event, they all contacted me and said, well, actually, the honest answer is we can't argue with the CEO. And they said, well, you should have said that at the time, kind of, because actually we've worked through that sort of trust, conflict, commitment model, and actually you're failing at the conflict because the CEO can't be disagreed with. So actually possibly we need to come back and revisit. But it's interesting, I think, for businesses to sort of assess themselves on that, and then we can sort of talk through how you might generate trust, or what is positive conflict. I'm not advocating that conflict for conflict's sake is a good thing. For sure, there are times when it's detrimental if the right environment isn't there or the subject matter's not relevant. It's to me about getting that, and that model does give a nice lens to be able to sort of delve a bit deeper, but actually come out ultimately to what are the right results that you want at the end of it.
So there's this story of Korean airlines that had a lower than average safety record, and they couldn't figure out why it was. It wasn't to do with the planes they were using, the same planes. What they found was there was a cultural issue where the co-pilot or the second in command wouldn't challenge the pilot. And what they found, looking at flight logs or looking back through black boxes where unfortunately there've been crashes, was that the number two, the second in command, the co-pilot, was, because of this deferential culture, wouldn't challenge the pilot, and quite literally planes were crashing, people were dying because they avoided that. There wasn't the culture of acceptable conflict.
It's again a lesson I learned personally. I mean, I'll tell two stories. One was actually, and it relates to South Korea, was talking to the South Korean football manager, and they have an issue in that their goalkeeper is the oldest person in the team. And within the Korean culture, you don't challenge your elder. So actually there was an instance where undeniably the goalkeeper had been at fault for certain things, and yet no one had held him to account because he was more senior than them. And actually my own experience was when I originally coached in Great Britain and got headhunted to go to Switzerland and became the head of Swiss rowing. And I suppose the longer story is I have the first meeting, about 45 minutes long. Everyone sort of in the organization is sat in front of me, and I deliver the new strategy, new philosophy, and I've come in to mandate to change. And I leave the room thinking that's the best meeting I've ever had, because it was amazing how much they've agreed to, how kind of actually willing they were to change what they've been doing before. But apparently the real meeting happened once I left the room, because who is he? What does he think he's doing? Why does he think what works in Great Britain is actually going to work here in Switzerland? And it was about 6 months in that somebody who actually was slightly sort of satellite player within the organization, he wasn't employed by the organization, but he had a lot of interaction with it. And he was the only one that had the confidence to come up to me and says, Tim, they will never disagree with you. And yet I was constantly finishing any meeting, any conversation with, if anyone's got any ideas, please come in. My door's always open. No one ever came in, but actually I would think of myself as an approachable sort of leader. And yet, whether it was a cultural thing in Switzerland, whether it was also that maybe I was a bit more scary than I wanted to be, and consequently no one was disagreeing with it. And actually Nick, the person who'd actually sort of spoken up and said, okay, your job now is to, during the next meeting, is to actually challenge me, and hopefully I will demonstrate how positively I receive criticism, because the other side of it was I was genuinely missing it. I like to think my leadership style is better when I am challenged and I have to justify, or I am redirected. Sometimes I might be going too fast down the wrong road, and actually you can help bring me back into line. And I really missed it. And consequently, we weren't actually going in the right direction, purely because they couldn't challenge me. And as I say, I thought that was inherent in my leadership style, but in that different situation, it definitely wasn't.
It wasn't. And did you resolve that afterward? Were you able to turn that around?
it got a lot better. And actually, I was so pleased that Nick came and said it, because it was something that was a real sort of an enlightening moment to me, and actually slightly banged myself on the head with it, because I was thinking about, why did I not realize that before? Like, having prided myself again in thinking that I'm approachable and that I really value alternative ideas and diversity, I was probably railroading them without realizing it. That actually, because I was so dominant in the room and um, so much up at the front, which I didn't want to be, but I was. And actually, so okay, one was Nick had to sort of challenge me, and we did try to develop the culture. In the end, we had this sort of silly agreement, which sounds funny, but actually helped, in that they could not start any statement with "but in Switzerland," and I was not allowed to use the phrase "well, in the UK we." That actually, we could have a conversation about what we thought was the better way to do it, but the sort of "but in Switzerland" meant they were so entrenched into the way it used to be, or I was using a different situation of why it could work, which might not be relevant to what the situation was for them. And it got a lot better. Yeah, it was still something, and ultimately, probably the way I resolved it was to realize I had to have more flexibility on the edges. I still had a core that was, in my mind, fundamentally necessary and fundamentally true about the quality and the quantity of things that we did, and certain cultures and environments. But okay, it's to realize that, yeah, this is Switzerland. This isn't Great Britain. These are different people. These are different sort of mentalities, different motivations, and actually understanding the why aspect was much more important for me to understand. And if I challenge myself now in leadership, is to spend longer on that why than I would have done previously. I'd immediately gone into the what's and the hows and the who we need to sort of get on board. But now I would much more actively try and understand your motivations for doing it, so I can then hold you to account, or I can kind of keep you committed in terms of your journey as well as mine.
So you went from being an elite athlete to coaching elite athletes, and then you go into the business world. You obviously do the work with the League Managers Association. So I guess, again, two questions. One is, how did you make that transition? And what advice would you have for anyone else on reflection who's looking to make a career transition?
It's again a really good question, and I'll answer the last part first. I was actually talking to someone the other day that was suggesting we should all do a "They Think It's All Over" podcast, because actually a lot of sports people, for example, or people in the military, end up retiring in their 30s, 40s, and sort of midlife, and yet still need to sort of live this life afterwards. And it's not always so easy. Actually, you've been very driven, very purposeful, um, aiming at one particular thing. For me, it's to win the Olympics, and yeah, I was lucky enough and good enough, I guess, to achieve that. But then I was 30, and actually, it's not a sport where you have a name or a fortune that you can then live off for the next 40 years of your life. So for me, initially, it was coaching, but then actually, even then, I realized after 25 years of doing it, I wanted a Sunday off. I've got kids who were young at the time when I made the decision, and I realized that sport, I mean, it's beautiful, but it's selfish. You have to be all in or you're not in, especially at that level. Um, and actually, I was coaching badly because of it. I was giving athletes days off, not because they needed days off, but because I wanted a day off. I mean, we mentioned the sort of self-improvement, and part of that is the sort of the self-challenge, I guess, that I had some skills that I thought were more relatable to sort of the wider field rather than just sport. I, I, I live in Oxford now, but actually at the time I was in Switzerland. But I signed up and did a course at the business school here in Oxford, Exec MBA, to try and teach me sort of more about business, about understanding the language that was used. I thought it would give me real direction. In fact, it probably just gave me a horizon to make me realize, well, hang on, actually, there are a lot of things that are relatable. Just because we don't call it strategy doesn't mean it's not strategy. That's kind of, well, just because we don't call it marketing doesn't mean it's not marketing. And actually, some of it was learning the new language, but also it was realizing that probably more a confidence thing of being able to apply some of the stuff that we've been doing within sport and putting it into business and into a wider world. And that was probably the major thing that I did. And now it involves sort of working with people who are generally sort of moving into that leadership space. The analogy sometimes of having been the expert, they might be the fantastic salesperson or the accountant or the lawyer, and now they're moving into a partnership role, or they've kind of developed a product. Even in terms of some of the entrepreneurs I've worked with that actually are looking now to develop their businesses and sort of build things up. I think some of the things and some of the lessons I've learned, I guess I just try and pass on so that they can either sort of take bits of what I've done, but also generally to find the journey for themselves, find that sort of pathway and direction that took me too many years probably to realize.
Is there anything you'd have done differently on reflection?
But when I win the Olympics, I have absolutely nothing in my diary moving forwards, like literally nothing. Like I've done that pretty deliberately, that September the 23rd, 10:30 in the morning was race. Yes, if we haven't finished by 10:36, we haven't got the result that we wanted. But anyway, but literally there was nothing, and that was almost a deliberate piece of mind. I then had this meeting, actually, again, it was Jürgen. He comes up and he's the one who says, "Tim, I think you'll be a good coach." And literally, it wasn't the next day, but it was not long after the Olympics. Pretty much the first meeting I had back afterwards, where he effectively was telling me my athletes' days were over, and yet he wanted an assistant, and actually he wanted me to be his assistant, which was a great job offer, but it meant that I transitioned very immediately from one to the other. But also, even actually, I guess with my coaching, I hadn't planned anything until my coaching journey was over, and then I went into business. So especially on that one, I guess I think I could and should have planned more, albeit I didn't want to railroad myself, I suppose, in a way, in a sort of personal way. I'm not necessarily a compulsive sort of thinker, but actually I'm also not somebody who has to walk the beaten track. That actually I quite like the idea of taking the path less trodden. I guess that's the kind of and so yeah, I mean, now making these decisions, I guess, is different. And I will admit, I mean, for example, when one of the really big moves I made in my coaching career was to Switzerland, but it was literally because they approached me, and I was a 30-something single man living on his own. It was an easy decision to make. Would you like to move to a beautiful country and open a Swiss bank account? It's kind of, the answer is yes. What then? Whereas actually, as life goes on, we have to sort of be a bit more considerate of others and want to be more considerate of other things. There's, I'll admit, more to life now than there was then, albeit there were big things then, but there were less of them. Whereas now there's a more broader range. So actually, it's about understanding that, and I think it does come back to understanding yourself and having that self-awareness of again what your reason why is.
Yeah. And so that's an interesting point about the why. So when you're training for the Sydney Olympics, you've got the clear, very, 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 very clear purpose. You and your teammates sit down the night before and talk about why, like each of your individual whys. But like, how has that like motivation or purpose changed for you personally after? So I guess even with coaching, like you're building up to World Championships, World Cup, Olympics, but then beyond sport, it's less clearly defined. You don't have those external markers. How have you found that motivation or why since?
I love working with people. I love, say whether it's personal improvement, but also helping others to improve themselves. And I think a lot of what I really get my rewards out of now is seeing you, or whether it's the football managers I work with, whether it's the business I work with, actually understand their journey and get to where they want to be. Like actually, that to me is very much my motivation, and I'll accept criticism of my wife. I mean, she criticizes me lots, but particularly she criticizes me on the, it still has to be about you. And I was like, well, actually, my answer is, well, my me now is about us. Or is about a family, and I've got two young children that part of my role is to encourage and support and provide for. So actually, it's understanding that in the rewards for me, but actually with the people I work with, it's to understand or help them understand where they want to go and help get them to actually achieve getting there.
So I guess the glory goes from your individual glory of receiving your medal from the Princess Royal to a different, I don't know, sounds a bit twee, doesn't it? But some sign kind of like shared glory with watching your children develop, watching people you work with develop.
It is. I mean, I mean, we all slightly lose our own identity in that I'm no longer Tim. I'm Heidi or Ash's dad, which is kind of fair enough. I'll accept that one. That's absolutely fine. But no, I don't mean it to sound twee, as you say, but actually, there was genuine pride. I mean, I was really lucky. I mean, mentioning it in parents, like my mum and dad were never sporty. They'd never rode. They'd never done anything in that sort of sphere yet. Were always there when I needed them. That actually, I was never pushed. I was never I was never questioned. Actually, I remember having a conversation with my dad when I left school and said, I'm going to become a rower. And he goes, well, son, it's an amateur sport. I was like, yep. I'm also going to become a fish filleter. My first job was as a fish filleter that paid enough money to allow me the daylight hours to go and row. So, okay, I sort of thought, I guess I preempted his question, but he'd have been perfectly in his rights to say, son, sure, this is a great career choice, but he never did. And yet he would always be the one driving me places before I could drive. Mum would be the one making the packed lunch. And yet, and they were always there. They traveled the world and actually, I think, had a great time in the end, supporting and following, but were never in the way. And I'd love to be that parent. I guess I wish I could go back and tell my parents how much I appreciate it and apologize for being the teenager that said, Mom, you're embarrassing me. Kind of just, but
I think that's a rite of passage, and I'm sure you're there with your children now being told how much you embarrass them. So
exactly. I've not been allowed to actually drop them off at the door. I've had to drop them round the corner just in case. To me, that's that. So I mentioned the parenting, but that's also, I guess, in the coaching I do within business, that it's knowing that you've beaten a part is the reward for me, rather than necessarily getting the medal or the reward, which actually is lovely to be able to recollect. And actually, the winning just made it a bit nicer, but it isn't necessarily the primary goal anymore.
So what you had to say about your parents was absolutely beautiful. Like how does that translate? What is your, so I think you said before that your daughter's started rowing. Like how are you with her? How do you support her?
Actually, and again, I honestly hope that it's not a conversation that she doesn't feel that she can be honest with me, because I love the little car rides. Like I have to drop her off. Like rowing is an early morning sport, and so when I think I've got a morning off, I have to drop her off at 7:00 at the river. And actually, I love the sort of 25 minutes you get of conversation. And I think I did say the other day is that I hope you don't feel I'm pushing you into this, or feeling that you don't feel that you have to do it just because I did it. And I know that she loves doing it. That actually, she said, it's a question her friends ask her is, how does it feel? Because not only myself, but my wife was a Olympic level archer. So we end up getting engaged at the Beijing Olympics. So the poor children have got these two parents who are kind of, competitive in their own right, in their own day. But actually, I think, and I do generally believe, that the children are doing it because they love to do it. Because I guess for me, the talent is to enjoy the journey, is to really, you get more out of yourself if you do it for the right reasons.
And I think that obviously translates to parenting, but also translates into a business environment as well, doesn't it? So often we're focused on what we need to do, or this drama, or this crisis, or this project, but actually, like looking back, see this Beautiful Business podcast, one of the things is just like the beauty of the people we get to spend our times with. For me, being completely honest, being able to chat to you on a Friday morning is just the absolute highlight of my week. So enjoying those bits is really important. So Tim, we're nearly out of time. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Lovely. I mean, really good questions. As you probably gathered, I'll chat about this all day. So now I've really enjoyed the chance to kind of recollect and put some thoughts together. And I hope it's been not just interesting, but useful for those that are listening.
Oh, massively. I think going over your 5 functions of a team's like really interesting model, looking at some of the comparisons between sport and business environments, your transition into coaching. I think some of the things that have come up around trust, around the healthy conflict, around like how you deal with pressure. I'd encourage anyone who's listened to this and enjoyed it to go and watch the Gold Fever documentary, because it's just phenomenal how you just smile all the way through. I hope you don't mind me bringing it up again, but it's absolutely something that will stay with me for a long time. So we've definitely taken loads of this. So what's coming up next for you professionally, Tim?
Actually, still working with some of the football managers. One of the programs I have is to help them in terms of their leadership journey. Again, a few of them are former players that work now with teams. Some of them, unfortunately, one of my managers got sacked a couple of weeks ago. So it's a difficult conversation, albeit for them, being sacked is probably how you and I would talk about being rained on. It's something that happens, and
part and parcel.
It's the brutal world. So there was a little bit of that. There's a little bit of otherwise working with businesses, some of them here in Oxford. But hopefully there's a new challenge. And actually there's sort of people there that could be sort of interested in developing their leadership journey. That for me, is that the interactions with people that I love doing is actually helping either for them to understand where they want to be or how they want to get there.
Obviously, this is the Beautiful Business podcast. One question we ask all of our guests is, and I'd love to hear your perspective, what does a beautiful business mean to you?
For me, a beautiful business was a business that knows where it wants to go, gets there, and then has members that want to be on and have benefited from that journey.
Okay, that's fast. So the people within it have been enriched in broader ways too.
Their reasons why are aligned with the business, and actually the employees, if they're employees, are committed and engaged to it in more than just the superficial way. That beautiful bit about it is that they can sort of see the impact that they're making. They understand how they're contributing to the greater goal, and that's something that they really want to do. The purpose of the business, I think, is it's still to achieve, and actually the business has to understand where it does want to go. But actually the people want to be part of that journey rather than being necessary for the journey to happen, if that makes sense.
I think that's a useful idea for anyone to take into their business and look around the people they're working with and understanding their whys in greater detail, perhaps.
Ultimately, it means that we agree on what we need to do and how we need to do it. But actually our own why is our motivation and our purpose of being there.
And the outcomes of that success will feed both of our whys in different ways.
That beautiful business has that alignment of it, that things sort of move in that same direction.
Final question: What's one piece of advice that you've obviously go into loads of businesses? I know it's hard to say what's one piece of advice, but if we were to finish up, we talked about lots of things today. What's one advice you give me or other people like me trying to build beautiful businesses?
It's to get that alignment of the reasons why you want to do things. Actually get that alignment of why, which allows you to understand people, to have the conversations, the difficult conversations sometimes that businesses aren't able to have. But understanding the why, developing that trust enables you to then sort of have these difficult conversations that you do need to have. If you don't have those conversations, then you might not be aiming for the right results. You might not be achieving the right results. You might not be addressing some of the issues that really do need to be addressed. So if there was one thing that I'd recommend, it's to go that bit deeper with those that you work with, or and understand that why element with people, because it can then sort of feed into so much more.
Such a good point. Tim, thank you so much for talking with me today. As I said, absolutely love that you've been so generous with your time and your reflections and your insights. I wish you all the best, and hopefully we'll get to work together again in the future.
Oh, I'd love to, Arbor. So I've loved listening to the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to take part in one. Happy to do it anytime you ask. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you for listening to the Beautiful Business Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please remember to subscribe and leave us a review. For more advice and practical tips on what it's really like to build a beautiful business, visit our content hub at wowco.uk/hub, or check out the link in the show notes.